Coming up, it's almost as if President Trump listened to episode 93 of this podcast and heeded my warnings. Okay, maybe I'm giving myself a bit too much credit there, but hey, you never know. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? First of all, I want to mention I wrote an article on redstate.com on July 4 entitled Employers Threaten Conservative Speech, Thought, and Expression. After you listen to this episode, be sure to check it out. Now let's talk about President Trump's speech at Mount Rushmore, and let's talk about the reaction of much of the press to it. Some pundits said in advance that the speech would be about unity. Much of the press, including CNN, of course, would have you believe it was about anything but unity. CNN even described the speech as, quote, dark, close quote. I would argue it was in fact about unity. It was about what binds us as a country. It was about our history, our founding, the enlightened, groundbreaking principles on which our country was formed. We should be able to agree on those, just as we should be able to agree, and I think it's obvious we do agree, that slavery was in overwhelming, direct, obnoxious conflict with those principles. It took too long, and it took a civil war and then a civil rights movement, but we eliminated that conflict. There is a hardcore left in this country that is trying to convince us that the country is rotten to the core, that its very founding was based on a desire to preserve the evil of slavery. The hardcore left, with the support of the corrupt propaganda wing of the Democratic Party, otherwise known as the news media, and the virtue-signaling support of huge numbers of large companies, seems to have convinced much of the country that America is based on and motivated by racism inherent in its founding and system. Therefore, monuments to its history, including its great former presidents, must be excised from the public square. I've watched with frustration and disgust as monuments around the country have been attacked, defaced, and destroyed. I understand opposition to Confederate monuments, but the way to get them removed is to lobby for their removal, to push for legislation requiring their removal. If there isn't enough support for such an effort, then they shouldn't be removed. And attempts to remove them by force constitute lawlessness, which should be dealt with as such. As to tributes to the Founding Fathers, former presidents, and other great American figures, I don't understand calls for their removal. I know why they're being defaced and torn down by rioters. I just don't understand any logical argument that they should be. The real reason they're being torn down is twofold. The first element is humiliation. The leadership of the riots is trying to humiliate Trump supporters. They're trying to humiliate those who love America, those who are patriotic. Anyone who doesn't believe America is rotten to the core. The second element is that they're trying to wipe away America's historical accomplishments. The hardcore leftists are actually trying to foment revolution. They're actually trying to tear down the American system of capitalism combined with a substantial social safety net and replace it with a Marxist system of redistribution of wealth. As I've mentioned before, the founders of Black Lives Matter are Marxists, and at least one of them, Patrisse Cullors, has admitted on video that we are, quote, trained Marxists, referring to herself and apparently co-founder Alicia Garza. Anybody actually considering trying to tear down the American system and replace it with a Marxist system has to ask themselves how are they going to do that when they can't really point to a Marxist state that's been an economic success, whereas the American system has produced an economic, military, and political superpower, a country so successful that people all over the world are trying to move here, legally and illegally. They can't really point to China because China's economic success never started until they introduced elements of capitalism and free market reforms. And on a per capita basis, China remains a small fraction of the American economy. So as to the inability to reference a successful Marxist state, I guess the best they can do is rely on a combination of an American education system which refuses to celebrate our successes, focuses only on our failures, and rarely even mentions the abject failures of Marxist states around the world, with a young leftist and academic leftist propensity to believe that they could do it better, that the failures of Marxism time and again were but a failure of the leaders of those countries to do it right, that somehow the leaders of the mobs tearing down statues around the country are going to be able to accomplish what leaders the world over have not been able to do: make Marxism work. But that's a tall order when the public has to compare it to the overwhelming economic success of the United States. So how do you deal with that? You eliminate it. You soil the history of the United States in the public mind to such an extent that it's considered illegitimate. None of the American founding fathers or the later presidents we celebrate were perfect. Everyone has flaws, and they were no exception. Even Lincoln, perhaps the closest to moral perfection of any of the figures in question, wasn't perfect. But when polls are conducted asking people to rank the greatest American presidents, Lincoln typically comes out on top. The American public recognizes his greatness. Even the most controversial of the prominent American presidents celebrated in statues, Andrew Jackson, a figure who no doubt had significant negatives associated with him, is understood by wide swaths of the American public to have exhibited brilliance and exceptionalism in several respects, including military brilliance and being a key figure in pushing to eliminate the requirement of property ownership to vote. So if the far left succeeds in their effort to soil all memories and vestiges of American greatness, to leave only the negative, only the flaws, then they'll be much closer to being able to pretend that a Marxist system could be something other than an abject failure by comparison, because when the comparison is made, it will be only to the flawed aspects of the American system, because that will be all that's allowed, all that is recognized, and all Americans, regardless of race, will suffer. And that is why President Trump labeled it for what it is when he stated, quote, "Our nation is witnessing a merciless campaign to wipe out our history, defame our heroes, erase our values, and indoctrinate our children." Close quote. We can't let that happen. President Trump recognizes that, and that is part of the message he delivered at Mount Rushmore. It's part of the message that we must unify. We must unify in opposition to decision by the mob. We must recognize and celebrate the greatness of our country. And we can't accept lawlessness. The decision as to whether statues stand in the public square can't rest in the hands of those who are willing to break the law to take that decision away from the voters and from the representatives they elected to make those decisions. President Trump recognizes that we must unify behind that principle. President Trump called out the unacceptable horror of cancel culture, quote, "driving people from their jobs, shaming dissenters, and demanding total submission from anyone who disagrees. This is the very definition of totalitarianism, and it is completely alien to our culture and our values, and it has absolutely no place in the United States of America. This attack on our liberty, our magnificent liberty, must be stopped, and it will be stopped very quickly." Close quote. He went on, quote, "In our schools, our newsrooms, even our corporate boardrooms, there is a new far-left fascism that demands absolute allegiance. If you do not speak its language, perform its rituals, recite its mantras, and follow its commandments, then you will be censored, banished, blacklisted, persecuted, and punished. It's not going to happen to us." Close quote. It's almost as if President Trump listened to episode 93 of this podcast and heeded my warnings. Okay, maybe I'm giving myself a bit too much credit there, but hey, you never know. The president then went on to talk about the greatness of each of the 4 presidents on Mount Rushmore, from the incredible bravery and leadership of George Washington, who President Trump noted even his adversary King George called the greatest man of the age, to Thomas Jefferson, the Renaissance man, inventor, scholar, diplomat, and brilliant visionary who drafted the Declaration of Independence, to Abraham Lincoln, the moral mountain who gave his life to ensure the continued existence of this great country, issued the Emancipation Proclamation, pushed through the 13th Amendment to end slavery, to Teddy Roosevelt, the youngest president, the only person ever to receive both the Congressional Medal of Honor and the Nobel Peace Prize, and the president most responsible for America's incredible national parks. President Trump's speech was a much-needed history lesson, a reminder that this president doesn't take his guidance from CNN or the New York Times or NBC or any one of 1,000 different news outlets expecting him to bow to the lawlessness of the mob and destruction of federal property because the media think it's called for. And it was a reminder dating all the way back to his inauguration speech that we are one nation. Back on January 20, 2017, when he spoke of, quote, crime and gangs and drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential, close quote. He said then, quote, we are one nation and their pain is our pain. Their dreams are our dreams and their successes will be our success. We share one heart, one home, and one glorious destiny. The oath of office I take today is an oath of allegiance to all Americans, close quote. Notwithstanding the claims of the media, Donald Trump has made it clear that he sees America as one America. He rejects absolutely the intersectional games of the left. And as he stated on the day of his inauguration, quote, at the bedrock of our politics will be a total allegiance to the United States of America. And through our loyalty to our country, we will rediscover our loyalty to each other. When you open your heart to patriotism, there is no room for prejudice, close quote. Think about that message. Realize it doesn't differ at all from what he said at Mount Rushmore. And ask yourself how on earth the media ever thought he was going to say anything different at Mount Rushmore. Then ask yourself, why on earth do I even listen to the media? The traditional news media is becoming more and more like a VHS tape. The quality's not there. It's cumbersome, and when it comes right down to it, there are better ways to get the product. And when it comes to the product that President Trump is delivering, it isn't perfect, but it's a lot better than I expected, and I continue to wholeheartedly endorse his reelection. And his speech at Mount Rushmore makes my convictions in that respect even stronger than they were. And then I look across the aisle at what's happening to the Democrat Party, and I realize that to say my convictions that we need to reelect Donald Trump are stronger than they were before doesn't even begin to describe how strong they really are. Next topic. Now national parks are racist? While we're on the subject of Teddy Roosevelt and the establishment of the national park system, let's talk about the latest evidence our society, at least as expressed through the mainstream news media, has gone nuts. America's national park system is a treasure. It's a treasure that I've explored myself and with my family, and it's part of some of the best memories of my life. I have recommended to untold numbers of friends that they have to check out our national parks. The main ones out west are so over-the-top beautiful that they're almost impossible to describe. There have always been national parks on my bucket list, and I still have a few to go. So imagine my surprise when I learned recently that America's national parks are racist. I guess the activists who claim that America is systemically racist really do mean that racism is everywhere in America, or at least they believe that to be the case, and the persons espousing that belief aren't limited to Black Lives Matter activists. In an ABC News article entitled "America's National Parks Face Existential Crisis Over Race," Sierra Club Associate Director Joel Pannell is quoted as saying, quote, "The outdoors and public lands suffer from the same systemic racism that the rest of our society does." Close quote. The article goes on to point out that only 23% of visitors to the national parks were people of color, even though minorities represent 42% of the population. So what's missing in that equation? There's no evidence presented that the fact that a lower percentage of the minority population visits national parks is because of racism. In fact, reaching the conclusion that the reason fewer minorities visit national parks is because of racism without actually providing evidence for that conclusion is not only illogical, but it's also contradictory. Contradictory of what exactly? It's contradictory of the premise for diversity as a goal. The premise most often given for diversity as a goal is that people think differently, and that those differences come out in the decision-making process when you have a diverse representation of people influencing the decision-making, including minorities. For that to be a correct analysis, you have to accept that one of the ways in which whites and blacks and other minorities may see things differently is the desirability of taking a national park vacation. The media used to understand that, but never underestimate the power of the narrative with the media. And right now, the narrative is racism. It's about systemic racism. It's all about systemic racism. And if the media can find something they can plug into the systemic racism narrative, they'll do it. The issue of minorities not visiting national parks isn't new. I remember a number of years ago, I think it was fairly soon after I'd taken my family to Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks, I read an article about the low numbers of blacks who visit national parks. But that article was written about a park ranger. He happened to be black, and he noted how unfortunate it was that blacks rarely visited national parks. That article appeared in the New York Times on November 2, 2010. It was authored by Maria Navarro. It was entitled, "National Parks Reach Out to Blacks Who Aren't Visiting." That was a far more accurate and far less over-the-top and incendiary title than the one ABC News chose. But that article ran in 2010, not an election year, and the Park Service at that time was in the hands of President Obama, resulting in a substantially different narrative for the news media as well as a substantially different goal given their worshipful coverage of President Obama. So what did the 2010 article say? It contained a plea by Park Ranger Shelton Johnson, an African-American who served as a ranger for 23 years. He had enlisted the support of Oprah Winfrey to try to boost African-American attendance in national parks. The article noted that the problem of low black attendance first came to the attention of the Park Service way back in 1960. The article did actually provide a potential explanation for why some blacks chose not to visit national parks. It noted that former education specialist at the Park Service, Nina Roberts, said many blacks were wary of people they might encounter in the parks, and that wariness is passed down through the generations. She included a story of a young woman she spoke to in a focus group who said that her grandfather told her, quote, "The KKK hangs out up in the mountains. Why would I want to go?" Close quote. That article also noted some efforts the Park Service was engaging in to promote African-American interest in the parks, including incorporating stories of black cavalrymen, so-called Buffalo Soldiers, who'd historically patrolled some of the parklands. Anyone who has listened to this podcast knows I'm no fan of the New York Times, but the difference in quality in the actual conveyance of a useful amount of accurate, unbiased information between the 2010 New York Times article and the 2020 ABC News article was startling. And the difference was not because of the two different news outlets. The difference is the presence of a narrative to fit in 2020 and the absence of one in 2010. And it's insisting on fitting the narrative that is a huge part of why the quality of the news media has collapsed and trust in it has plummeted. The truly sad part is we know what's wrong, but the likelihood that it will ever be fixed is about as low as it gets. But there's one thing that has a high likelihood, that I'll be back next week with a new episode of Political Spirits. Be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits. And follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.